success in all of the discussions around the African Union, European Union strategy later in the year. So thank you, Minister, for these valuable perspectives. I'd now like to broaden out the discussion to include our other two distinguished guests, Luc Soete in Maastricht and Katrine Andersen in Seattle, Washington. So thank you both for joining us this afternoon. A very warm welcome to you. And I'd like to start actually with, if you like, a helicopter view on something that Minister Nzimande just mentioned in his last remarks, specifically around openness. And for many years, the European Union has championed principles of open science, open access, and collaboration at an international level. So my question to the two of you, perhaps first to Katrine and then to Luc, is, will a new age of technology sovereignty put these at risk? And can they be sustained? What would you like to say to that, Katrine?
We certainly, at the Gates Foundation, see technology as great enablers of solving the difficult problems in this world. And we hope that focus on technology sovereignty will not prevent that innovative technologies reach the populations and people that need them most. So, we certainly hope that this will not be a hindrance to continued global collaboration. And also, as you know, when we at the Gates Foundation invest in cutting edge technology, on any technology investments, making sure that those innovations will be available to the people that need them most is one of the key pillars of our investment. And in general, we have not found that to be a barrier to innovators at large.
Well, that's a very optimistic view. I wonder whether Luc Soete shares the same one. Luc, you've been studying technology trade, innovation trade, and so forth for many years at the international level. What do you see as the prospects for the maintenance of open science, open access, open technology, and collaboration in an age of tech sovereignty?
Well, let me start from the comments which Minister Nzimande made when he said that the crisis as an immediate impact leads to looking at one's own and at one's own country. And I think this is very obvious in the case of COVID-19, also in Europe. That is that countries were looking at their own responses, their own health policies, etc. But I still believe, and I share the optimism of Mrs. Andersen, that we have in Europe, what people often forget from the outside is that the European Union is composed of small countries. The large countries such as Germany, France, Italy, the UK, there was a time, the UK also, were the exceptions within the European Union. And given that this is a union of relatively small countries, openness is really intrinsically part of the European Union. It is really the basis of the whole union in both in economic terms, in reaping scale economies, specialization, mobility in terms of the Schengen agreements about both commercial mobility as well as citizens' mobility. So from that perspective, I think that openness is intrinsic in the European Union project. So I would say also following on from Mrs. Andersen, you see this very clearly in the COVID-19 crisis. You see that at the level of science, European scientists, just as Chinese scientists, just as American scientists, just as any other scientist in the world, have collaborated in a very open way with open access, providing the data they got, providing the tests they got, exchanging it amongst them. And what you observed at the national health policies, which is a very different area where research is much less involved and which is much more a political health decision, there you found the national part emerging in response to the crisis. So I think that if we look at the science part and at the technology part, I still believe strongly that Europe will continue to stand for open science, for sure, open data, open access, that with respect to technology, openness might be questioned on a number of very specific issues with respect to strategic production or strategic technologies, where there is an area of indeed technological sovereignty, because indeed the dependence of abroad is something which in a European Union framework one will want to diagnose, when we want to identify, and there I think there might be a response in terms of some kind of technological sovereignty or some strategic interest in keep making sure that the value chains create also local value. But I would remain optimistic, yes.
Good. Well, I'm very pleased to have that optimism from both of you. Now, perhaps Minister Nzimande, the question that Luc raises in the end of his remarks about investment in strategic value chains or strategic sectors, is this something that for you is likely to rise up the political agenda in Africa, or at least in some of your other multilateral research and innovation partnerships?
Yes, what Luke is raising is something that is very high up on our agenda. For instance, the African Union has placed industrialization as our priority number one, that it is very important. But now we also know very well that without increased investment into research and development, as well as science, technology, and innovation, we are not going to be able to realize our industrialization. That is why for us as South Africa, we have said, because as the English saying goes, every cloud has a silver lining. This cloud of COVID-19 provides a silver lining in the sense that it actually provides us with an opportunity to actually invest towards this industrialization. Like, for instance, our production of our own ventilators has been we see this as a very important platform to actually continue to build capacity for industrialization. So for us in South Africa, we've placed science, technology, and innovation really at the center of what we call a post-COVID-19 economy that we need to be developing. That is why also we are quite attracted with the EU's characterizing of the post-COVID-19 period as not making European economies to bounce back, but that we need to bounce forward, which is a very important thing. And we can't bounce forward, without more investment into research and development. In fact, our partnership with Europe and the rest of the world as the African continent must also focus on how do we continue to mobilize resources into research and development, which in South Africa, we link it very strongly with the importance of partnership with industry, because without partnership with industry, we are not going to do this. Without taking much time, for example, in South Africa, we have got a tax incentive system where companies that are investing in research and development get up to 150% return for the monies that they have invested into that as part of incentivizing research and development within the context of our overall goals, offer a skills development and an innovation-driven economic recovery strategy.
Well, I'm delighted that you mentioned incentives, Minister. That was going to be the next topic that we moved on to, so it's a perfect segue to ask a couple of related questions, first to Luc and then to Katrine. Luc, technology-driven development in many regions of the world is also dependent on knowledge flows, whether that's in IP or in data or in patenting, access to licenses, etc. And so I wonder, do you think in a new age of technology sovereignty, these knowledge flows are likely to become more regional, or can we maintain the kind of global framework that we have at the moment? And then the second question for Katrine will be about what funding agencies can do to incentivize that, to ensure that the knowledge flows are going to those who need them most. So Luc, first to you.
Well, you make a very good point, Simon. That is that at the moment, of course, the global world, certainly when you look at the valorization of technology in terms of licenses and patents and various other intellectual property mechanisms, is under pressure. The openness is clearly, you see this in terms of the various shifts which have occurred both in China and in the US, that the pressure on proprietary knowledge has increased. And I think this is clear that there is a new link emerging between technology advance and technological competitiveness and the links with possibly strategic advantages, certainly related, for instance, to military power, but also to artificial intelligence, to possibilities whereby you can control larger sets of data at the global level. I'm talking here very much about the commercial side, not the open science we talked just a minute ago about. So in that sense, it's clear that if you look at licensing incomes, and you can see that indeed there is a significant decline, for instance, in the Chinese amounts of licensing payments which go to Europe or go to the US, and there is an increase there in the clear technological sovereignty of China, which is, in my view at least, to be welcomed because it's part of further development. So in that sense, you see that you move towards some kind of regional blocks in terms of technological strength, technological competitiveness, so to say, amongst these three regions. I think the position of Europe in there has to remain one which could be called soft power, it could be called even naive in some senses, but it has to remain one in terms of standing for the way in which open science and open innovation will generate much more advantages to Europe in terms of the access to that knowledge than a move towards Europe first in the sense of protecting European firms and European knowledge in a very narrow sense. And I think this is really where you see this, for instance, coming back to the COVID-19 crisis. You saw this very much in the debate on the vaccines, whereby you had, I think this is where the internal European dynamics, as I mentioned before, will always be in a direction of openness. You saw this in the COVID-19 vaccine discussion. You had these 4 European countries, France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, who bought up a very large, or ordered a very large stock of the potential vaccine coming forward from AstraZeneca and Oxford. Immediately you saw the European Commission responding by saying, we as the European Commission will stand for the rule of Europe there. So you see this internal competition which there is within Europe, in my view, will always be a guarantee for limiting the way in which a Europe first strategy would develop into a German first, French first, whatever specific member state first strategy. And I think that internal control within the European Union is, for me, the reason why I remain optimistic that if we talk about technological sovereignty and Europe first strategies at the industrial level, they will always be relatively limited to some strategic sectors, whereby the fact that Europe does not have a defense sector, as China has or as the US has, will always be the factor which will guarantee to some extent this openness.
Thank you very much, Luc. And I think we can certainly broaden out a little bit beyond COVID as perhaps a microcosm of some of these key issues to sort of like health and life sciences, technologies, research and innovation as a whole. Now obviously, Katrine, at the Gates Foundation, it's part of your mission to ensure that the best science and technology in health and life sciences reach everyone who needs them. And as a very significant investor in these new emerging fields of technology, you have quite an interesting model in trying to ensure that the intellectual property, that the knowledge flows continue. Perhaps you could just share a few insights about how you approach that and what kind of lessons we might take for some of the other much larger programs like Horizon Europe or similar, with similar goals.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to share information about our global access policy. So basically, you know, we always make our investments with all types of partners to make sure that innovation actually reaches the people that need the most. So that means that we, of course, want to make sure that knowledge generated, data generated becomes widely available and its information is shared with relevant stakeholders. We are, of course, cognizant that you know, innovative industries and partners need to secure their IP, and we actually want the partners to secure their IP as long as we make sure that we always have a pathway to get licenses, that we can so product can't be available in the developing countries where we need this technology to be accessible. And I think another key point here is that it has to be accessible at an affordable price for those markets, which is also one of our key principles. So in essence, you can still sell your technology or exploit it in other markets as long as you make the commitment that it will be available at an affordable price. Under the another piece that we are very concerned about is also that there is not an undue delay in bringing those technologies to low and lower middle income countries. So we often have conversations with our partners on how can we expedite that technology actually reaches global markets. So that is basically, I think, something that funders can play a major role in making sure that the implementation plans and product introductions are proactively looking into how to make that technology available.
Very good, thank you. And I think certainly the Gates model has proven to be an enormously successful one, including in some sensitive sectors where perhaps intellectual property is extremely well defended, but through different funding programs such as the Gates Foundation, that knowledge actually flows out into communities that need it most. So perhaps if I can sort of relay the same kind of question to Minister Nzimande. I mean, as the Minister for Science and Innovation, plus of course higher education in South Africa, you oversee a huge portfolio of national programs. And I wonder what kind of criteria you think you will need to build into your own funding programs and instruments as you go forward to ensure that there are these continued knowledge flows of intellectual property, of technology licenses, of data, perhaps more importantly than anything, into the South African research and innovation community. And by extension, how do you manage that in relations to your partnerships with industry?
The issue, thank you very much, that we are raising about funding and resourcing of research and development and science and innovation, it's a crucial issue. I should have just shared, from the beginning that last year our cabinet, in 2019, approved a new white paper for science, technology, and innovation. And one of the most creative things that is suggested there, which is the task that I'm looking at now, is the establishment of a sovereign innovation fund. This sovereign innovation fund, we see it as one very crucial instrument for funding science, technology, and innovation at various levels. Firstly, the fund in itself, we will have to build it together with industry. So industry is very important. But we are going beyond that, which is also aspects that Karen is touching upon. Our own philosophy in South Africa is that innovation is everywhere. In other words, innovation must not just be an elitist project. You find innovation in grassroots communities. You find innovation in various parts of civil society. And those also need to be funded if we are to be able to actually harness the capacity that we actually have. And the Innovation Fund can also play a very important role. Of course, we also still receive money from the fiscus to support this, but we are saying it's not enough. Because in South Africa at the moment, we are at 0.8% of our GDP that is invested into research and development. And our plan is that by 2030, we should be at least at 1.5% of our GDP, if not beyond. So the Innovation Fund will play a role, the money from the fiscus, and that is also why we are incentivizing industry, because out of those incentives, we are actually going to get huge benefits with innovation and also further generating resources. But one of the things I want to look at, I know this is I'm looking at. I know this is a very sensitive topic, Lots of research and innovation is funded from the public purse. But sometimes some of those do not come back to actually resource your public research and development system. So what I'm looking at now is how do we ensure that those projects that we fund, we commercialize, we are actually also as government able to actually get back some resources into government so that we can reinvest into more of R&D and science and innovation. So in other words, we need a multiplicity of strategy, taking into account the fact that we are a developing country and the continent is a developing region. And by the way, 36 of the most poor countries in the world are in the African continent. So we need to be very creative around innovation and funding and identifying multiplicity of sources and partnership with industry.
Thank you, Minister. And I think that actually raises an excellent point to play back to Luc and to Katrine as well. This question about how to go from sort of a linear relationship from public R&D funding to commercialization and largely privatized value to a more circular one, where you balance commercial considerations with societal needs and, if you like, trying to close a loop in terms of value creation so that there are more commercial returns flowing back into public programs. Do either of you have any very good ideas or strong recommendations about ways in which that could be done? Luc.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on this topic, of course. This is really where the notion of a circular economy should be extended exactly as Minister Nzimande mentioned in a circular research framework. And I think there's been a lot of literature on this these days and also last year. The European Union created this European Innovation Council next to the European Research Council, precisely to get this dynamics going in terms of innovation. Exactly as Minister Nzimande mentioned, it's not just in Africa that innovation is at all levels, at the bottom of the pyramid as well as the top. Innovation is all around us. And in that sense, it has to be supported not just with excellent research and the ERC and the top scientists, but it has to cross the whole border of the research innovation framework. And that raises immediately the issue about funding and investing in R&D and STI more broadly. I think there, I'm sure Simon and even Mr. Nzimande will for sure remember or know the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who has pointed out exactly the point made by Minister Nzimande. That is that you put a lot of public research into various areas, and think indeed of the health sector. Of course, there are areas such as, there was the Gates Foundation, there are other players in the market, but there was a lot of public funded research in there. And then finally, through the whole research and the trials, it ends up in protected intellectual property innovation coming on the market. And the way in which this public funding produces also a return in terms of revenues to the government, etc., is one of the most important issues which needs to be debated in a much more direct way. I think that it is in the interest of industry to have its private R&D fully complementary to the public R&D. And in a lot of research carried out in this whole area of the economics of research and development, you find that in many countries there is a perfect complementarity between the two. So that when the public is investing more in research and development, it attracts more private R&D. It provides more incentives for firms to invest more in applied R&D in various valorization programs in terms of extracting value, which they can then proprietary appropriate, but it is a system that works well. But in some countries, you find clearly signals that there is pure substitution. That is that if the public R&D is being funded, you find that the private R&D is relying on that public R&D and no longer carrying out its own R&D. And I think this is where we have to find the balance between the two, and we have to find the system, the interaction between the two, so that private firms can use indeed public R&D, exploit it in terms of to their advantage, indeed to their profitability, but with a social goal as to improve welfare in whatever form. I think this is really the way in which we talk about societal challenges, we talk about missions, we talk about the European Union at the moment, of course, with its European Green Deal, is clearly giving a direction in which areas it would like to see much more private R&D being carried out also. And that sort of search for complementarity, I think, is one of the biggest public policy challenges we face today.
Thank you, Luc. And Katrine, is this something that you would share from the Gates Foundation perspective? You obviously put a high priority on the valorization of the investments that you make, but with real value being delivered at local and societal level. But do you have any other thoughts on how to try and close this loop around creating value that also streams back to support future public programs and the complementarity with the kind of initiatives that you undertake, also with industry partners?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually, we have a very good example of how the different sectors has worked really well together within the tuberculosis R&D space. As the minister will be very much aware of, we have within, for instance, in TB drug discovery, collaboration platforms where we have a vast collaboration between academic institutions, private sector companies who offer their R&D organizations capabilities, and when that is mixed then with both funding from the Gates Foundation, contributions from the private sector companies, and contributions from scientific institutions, we actually have a space where innovation happens and where we have a vast degree of open science and knowledge exchange. And the way we can then we secure that this will be generating societal value is really through the commitment to global access. So again, products that comes out of this, can generate income from all kind of markets. But again, with the commitment to make those products available at an affordable cost in developing countries, I think that is an example of a really good model of how the different sectors can work together and create meaningful product development.
And thank you very much for those insights. Perhaps it's a model that we need to reflect more on how it could be exported to other parts of the world, or perhaps aligned with the approaches in the upcoming framework program, Horizon Europe. Now, we're rapidly running out of time, I regret to say. Sorry, you wanted to add one more thing, Katrine?
No, I was just going to say that, and in these endeavors, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge the really strong contributions also from the European Commission under the IMI program that has been extremely well suited to continue some of these development programs. So I think it is an example of how we can leverage different innovative platforms on how to create these kind of product development collaborations.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, we're rapidly running out of time, but we're going to ask for one final reflection, kind of forecasting exercise from each of you. And it's to sort of try and cast yourself out to 2030 and what you think the global research and innovation environment will look like. Will we be still operating broadly on global lines? Will we have indeed shifted to more regional models and cooperation? And by extension, where do you think a Europe-first approach will leave Europe in 10 years' time? As a strong, influential global leader, championing the values of open science and open innovation, or sandwiched between the US and China? So perhaps, Luc, let's hear your first thoughts on this, then Katrine, and then we'll close with Minister Nzimande.
Well, I think that intrinsically Europe first has strong limitations, and that's in 2020 the case, and it will also be in 2030 the case. And that has simply to do with the fact that it's not a political union. And if it's not a political union, it has not the military power to make a Europe first real. The US, China, India, even South Africa to some extent can create a framework of a India first, China first, US first strategy, because there is behind it a military power. There is a political power. There is a national power in the sense of an identity with citizens which you can exploit in terms of paying the price for such a national country-first strategy. I think Europe, as I tried to argue before, is intrinsically a union of small member states with a couple of exceptions, and that means that basically these countries need each other. And there is no other area where they need each other much more than in research. And you see this in the sense, if you look simply at the size, the absolute size in terms of volume of the research spent in the different European member states. Even in my own country here in the Netherlands, the amount of resources spent on a yearly basis is less than what Europe Horizon program spends on a yearly basis. So you can never cover all the research fields. You will always have to rely on other countries and on collaboration with other countries. So I still think that in Europe 2030, I hope we will be focused very much on the European Green Deal, on having how cities, regional authorities have advanced in terms of creating new circular economy, circular research frameworks in which they create much more value at the local level in responding to the many climate and other challenges in the environmental fields. I also hope that the digital agenda, the digital transformation process will have received a major boost, creating more welfare in a local framework, but it will still be in a very much global research context of international collaboration with both the rest of the world. I think in this sense, where the European Union stood always for open science, open innovation, and open to the world, will still be there in 2030.
Very good. Well, in the interests of time and with sincere apologies to Katrine, I'm just going to turn to Minister Nzimande for the closing word and his perspective on this, the world in 2030 as you see it, sir. It appears as though the Minister may no longer be with us. So with that, I think it's the right time to wrap up. Oh, you are still there, sir. Please.
Yes, sorry.
Your final
I
word.
muted myself. No, I wanted to say in conclusion, I should say also just in relation to Katrine, we regard philanthropies as having a very important role to play. In fact, catalytic roles, providing resources on science to solve immediate problems, new areas of research and capacity development. But as I have said, the world is becoming increasingly interdependent. A Europe that seeks to isolate itself is not going to get much anywhere. And we are pleased even right now that at least many European countries are siding against this tendency towards unilateralism to actually emphasize multilateralism. And also just to say, by the way, there is no contradiction between sovereignty, national sovereignty and multilateralism. The two things usually sometimes go together. Strong sovereign nations are best placed to be able to play in the multilateral game in a very, very important way. So the two things are not always in contradiction, but of course there is the unintended consequences of inward looking at the expense of multilateral cooperation. Once more, thank you very much for inviting us into this very exciting discussion.
Thank you, Minister. And that's actually the perfect note on which to close, because that was a statement made by Commissioner Gabriel in the opening plenary this morning, the balance between sovereignty and multilateral cooperation. So with that, thank you ever so much, Minister Nzimande, Soete, and Katrine Andersen for your time this afternoon. That's it for this plenary session. I'm now going to hand back over to Marilyn Fiaschi for closing remarks and to bring the conference to an end. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to the speakers of this last session. So just a quick summary of what we heard today. So very few points, but first of all, technology sovereignty is clearly officially on the EU agenda, but it worries many people. Thomas Reichel, on behalf of the German presidency of the EU, said greater technological sovereignty is by definition the goal of Horizon Europe. But at the same time, Solvay and Airbus representatives warned against closing doors. And while others are saying that with COVID-19, we should be working together around the world, not putting up boundaries. Yet Commissioner Gabriel says that sovereignty and cooperation are possible at the same time. So in sum, this is all a very puzzling policy landscape, a lot to explore. Our 8 workshops, thematic workshop, produce a series of recommendations about what the EU should do if it wants to promote technology sovereignty. And just to name a few of these recommendations, one is enlarging and improving networks for researchers and investors to connect. Another one is boosting spending for both breakthrough and deployment of technology, and finally to include more digital skills training under Horizon Europe. There is much more to say, so stay tuned. More news highlights are going to be published on the Science Business website this week, and in fact a full conference report will be published next week, Tuesday. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, the Science Business is now launching with this conference a technology sovereignty initiative that will keep us busy for at least 6 months, or even up to the spring next year. So again, if you want to join and if you want to contribute to this initiative, please get in touch. I think the email address of my colleague Gail Cardew is at the top of the blog, so feel free to get in touch with her. Again, a big thank you to all the speakers who joined us throughout the day. I'd like to thank the Science Business staff, not only to those who moderated, but also those in the background who did a fantastic job. Thank you to all the participants, to the audience. Just a quick word, you can use the B2B platform if you'd like to set up a few other bilateral meetings and keep networking for the next 48 hours. And finally, a warm thank you to the partners, to the sponsors of this conference that I'll name again: Attract, EIT Health, EIT Urban Mobility, BBI Joint Undertaking, and the Innovative Medicine Initiative. With that, I'd like to wrap up here, and I look forward to seeing you all in a future Science Business event. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.